Frank Sinatra gripped the microphone. 1,200 people sat in silence, waiting. He was about to sing the first note. A voice rose from the front row. "Mr. Sinatra, before you sing, everyone should know something." Frank turned. His orchestra stopped. The room held its breath. The man standing held a notebook and pen, a cold smile on his face. "I'm Richard Caldwell, music critic for the New York Herald. I've been covering your career for 12 years. Caldwell stepped forward. "And tonight, in front of all these people, I'm going to expose who you really are." Frank's hand tightened on the microphone. Nobody moved. "You're not a real singer. You're a manufactured product, and I'm going to prove it." 8 minutes later, that same critic stood applauding, tears streaming down his face, and he didn't know why. The Sands Hotel showroom in Las Vegas, June 1964, Tuesday night. The kind of night where the desert heat still clings to the air even after sunset, where the neon lights outside bleed through the windows in streaks of red and gold, where cigarette smoke hangs thick enough to taste. The room designed for elegance, velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, round tables covered in white cloth, each table holding a candle that flickers whenever someone walks past. The audience arrived dressed for the occasion, men in tailored suits and thin ties, women in evening gowns and pearls. The kind of crowd that came to see Frank Sinatra, not just because they liked music, but because being there meant something, meant status, meant they were part of a moment that mattered. Frank stood center stage, one hand resting on the microphone stand, the other hanging loose at his side. He wore a black tuxedo, crisp white shirt, black bow tie perfectly straight, his hair combed back smooth, face clean-shaven, expression calm. At 48 years old, Frank Sinatra looked exactly like what he was, someone who had spent 3 decades learning how to own a room, how to hold attention without saying a word, how to make 1,200 strangers feel like he was singing only to them. Behind him, a 20-piece orchestra sat ready, instruments in hand, waiting for his signal. The conductor stood off to the side, baton raised, watching Frank for the slightest movement, the smallest nod that would bring the music to life. But before any of that could happen, Richard Caldwell stood up. He didn't stand casually, didn't rise politely like someone excusing themselves to the restroom. He stood with purpose, with intention, with the deliberate movements of someone who wanted every eye in the room to notice, and they did, one by one. Heads turned. Whispers started spreading, people nudged their companions, pointed toward the front row. The orchestra members glanced at each other, confused. Frank didn't move, just watched, his hand still resting on the microphone stand, his face giving nothing away. Caldwell stood in the front row, center seat, the best seat in the house. He wore a gray suit, horn-rimmed glasses, thin mustache carefully trimmed. In his left hand, a leather-bound notebook. In his right, a silver fountain pen. He held both items up slightly, making sure everyone could see them, making sure everyone understood he was here in an official capacity. Not a fan, not a casual observer, a professional, someone whose opinion mattered, someone whose words carried weight. The room went silent, not the comfortable silence of anticipation before a performance, the heavy silence of tension, of uncertainty, of everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Frank's orchestra lowered their instruments slightly, no longer ready to play, just watching. The conductor's baton dropped to his side, even the waiters standing against the back wall stopped moving, frozen mid-step, drinks balanced on trays. Caldwell spoke, his voice carried easily through the room, trained projection, the voice of someone used to public speaking, used to being heard. He spoke clearly, deliberately, each word carefully chosen. He introduced himself. Explained he was Richard Caldwell, senior music critic for the New York Herald, one of the most respected newspapers on the East Coast. Explained he had covered Frank Sinatra's career for over a decade, reviewed countless performances, written dozens of articles, analyzing Frank's technique, his style, his influence on American music. And then he said something that changed the temperature of the entire room. He said Frank Sinatra wasn't a real singer. He said Frank was a product of careful marketing, expensive production, studio engineering that covered flaws and amplified strengths. He said Frank's voice was average at best, his range limited, his technique borrowed from better singers who never received the recognition they deserved. He said Frank's success was built on image, not talent, on charm, not skill, on the willingness of audiences to believe in a manufactured myth rather than demand genuine artistry. And tonight, Caldwell said, he was going to prove all of this, in front of 1,200 witnesses, with Frank standing right there, unable to hide behind studio production, unable to rely on audio engineering, just Frank, a microphone, and an orchestra, raw, unfiltered, exposed. The room erupted, not with sound, with tension that felt physical like pressure building before a storm. Some people gasped, others whispered urgently to their companions. A few men in the back stood up, angry, ready to defend Frank. Women covered their mouths in shock. The orchestra members looked at Frank, waiting for instruction, waiting to see if they should keep going or stop everything right now. But Frank didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't respond at all. He just stood there, hand on the microphone, watching Caldwell with the same calm expression he'd worn before the interruption. His breathing steady, his posture relaxed. Like Caldwell's words meant nothing, like this kind of challenge happened every night. Caldwell sat back down, satisfied, confident, certain he had just set the stage for Frank's public humiliation. He opened his notebook, clicked his pen, ready to document everything, ready to write the article that would redefine Frank Sinatra's legacy, ready to be the critic who finally told the truth. Frank waited. Let the tension build, let the room hold its breath, let everyone wonder what he would do next. Then, without a word, he gave the smallest nod to his conductor, just a slight dip of his chin. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious to anyone who wasn't watching closely. The conductor raised his baton, the orchestra lifted their instruments, and Frank Sinatra began to sing. But he didn't sing the song everyone expected, didn't sing the popular hits that filled radio stations, didn't sing the crowd pleasers that audiences came to hear. He sang something else, something quieter, something older, a song most people in that room had never heard before. A song from the early days of his career, before the fame, before the sold-out shows, before the world knew his name. The song started slow, a simple melody, piano playing soft chords, strings coming in gentle, supporting but not overwhelming. Frank's voice entered barely above a whisper, intimate, personal, like he was singing to one person instead of 1,200. No power, no projection, no theatrics, just his voice, raw and unadorned, delivering lyrics about loss, about memory, about moments that slip away before you realize they're gone. The first verse revealed something. Frank wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't trying to prove Caldwell wrong with technical virtuosity or showmanship. He was doing something else entirely. He was telling a story, using his voice not as an instrument of power, but as a tool of communication, of connection, of emotional truth. Every word chosen carefully, every phrase shaped precisely, every breath placed exactly where it needed to be, not for technical perfection, but for meaning. The audience started changing. The tension didn't disappear, it transformed, shifted from confrontation to attention. People stopped whispering, stopped moving, just listened, really listened. Not to judge, not to critique, just to hear what Frank was saying through the music. Caldwell sat in the front row, pen in hand, notebook open, but he wasn't writing, he was listening too. His expression unchanging, skeptical, unmoved, waiting for the proof he needed, the evidence that would support everything he'd just claimed. Frank continued. Second verse. The melody stayed simple, but something was building. Not volume, not intensity, something subtler. The way he emphasized certain words, the way he let silence hang between phrases, the way he used the space in the music as carefully as he used the notes. He was demonstrating something without stating it directly, showing rather than telling, proving his point through action rather than argument. The orchestra followed him perfectly. They weren't just playing their parts, they were responding to him, adjusting in real time, supporting his choices, giving him space when he needed it, filling gaps when he created them. This wasn't rehearsed, this was happening live right now, a conversation between Frank and the musicians behind him, a collaboration built on years of experience and mutual understanding. The third verse brought a shift. Frank's voice opened up slightly, still controlled, still intimate, but with more depth, more resonance. He was revealing layers, showing that what Caldwell called average was actually something else. Precision, choice, the deliberate decision to use only what was necessary, to strip away excess, to focus on truth rather than display. Then came the bridge. The music pulled back, just piano now, soft, delicate, barely there, Frank's voice alone, carrying the melody without any support. And this was the moment. This was where Frank demonstrated what real singing meant, not hitting high notes, not sustaining phrases for impossible lengths, not performing vocal acrobatics that impressed but didn't communicate. Instead, he showed how to use imperfection purposefully, how to let vulnerability become strength, how to make every word matter more than the sound of your voice. He sang a line about regret, about a choice made years ago that still echoed in the present, and the way he delivered it with a slight rasp in his voice, with a breath that broke the phrase in an unexpected place, with a note that bent just slightly flat before resolving, communicated something words alone couldn't express. It felt real, it felt human, it felt like truth. The audience began to understand. This wasn't about technical perfection. This was about something deeper, about using your voice to convey meaning, to create connection, to make people feel something genuine, rather than just admire your skill. Frank wasn't trying to be the best singer in the room. He was trying to be the most honest one. Caldwell's expression started to change, subtle at first, just a slight shift in his eyes, a softening of the hard line of his mouth, his pen lowered, his notebook forgotten. He was listening now, not as a critic, not as someone looking for flaws, but as a human being responding to another human being's expression of truth. The final verse arrived. The orchestra came back in, but differently now, fuller, richer, supporting Frank's voice as it opened completely, not louder but deeper, more resonant, carrying decades of experience, of pain, of joy, of everything that made him who he was. He sang about acceptance, about learning to live with choices, about finding peace, not in perfection but in honesty. And then the song ended, not with a dramatic flourish, not with a sustained note held for applause, just ended, naturally, quietly. The way real moments end, the music faded, Frank's voice disappeared into silence. The room held still. Nobody applauded. Not yet, they were too caught in the moment, too affected by what they'd just heard to immediately react with noise. They sat in that silence, processing, feeling, understanding something they couldn't quite put into words. Frank stepped back from the microphone, looked directly at Caldwell, didn't smile, didn't gloat, just looked at him with an expression that seemed to say, "You wanted proof. There it is." Caldwell sat frozen, his notebook closed now, his pen capped, his face had completely changed. The skepticism gone, the smugness vanished, replaced by something else, something he clearly wasn't expecting to feel. His eyes were wet, not crying, not yet, but emotional, moved, affected in a way he didn't seem to understand. Then, slowly, Caldwell stood, not with the aggressive purpose of his first interruption, with something else, something uncertain, something almost involuntary. His hands came together, once, twice, clapping, applauding, not the polite applause of social obligation, real applause, genuine, heartfelt. And as he stood there, clapping, a tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away, didn't seem to notice it, just stood there, applauding, his face showing confusion, wonder, something like revelation. The rest of the room erupted. Everyone standing now, thunderous applause filling the space. But Frank wasn't watching them. He was watching Caldwell, seeing the transformation, seeing someone who came to destroy him instead being changed by him. The performance continued. Frank sang 6 more songs that night, each one different, each one demonstrating a different aspect of his artistry. Fast songs where he showed perfect timing and rhythm. Slow songs where he revealed emotional depth. Songs with difficult melodies that he navigated with apparent ease. Songs with simple melodies that he made profound through interpretation. But the first song remained the most important. The one that proved what singing really meant. The one that showed Richard Caldwell he'd been measuring the wrong things, judging by the wrong standards, looking for technical perfection when he should have been listening for human truth. After the show ended, after the audience filed out still talking about what they'd witnessed, after the orchestra packed their instruments and left, Caldwell remained, sitting in his front row seat, notebook still closed, pen still capped, just sitting there, staring at the empty stage. Frank came back out, still in his tuxedo but with the bow tie loosened, collar unbuttoned. He walked to the edge of the stage, looked down at Caldwell, didn't say anything, just waited. Caldwell finally spoke. His voice quiet, nothing like the confident projection from earlier. He said he came here tonight to destroy Frank Sinatra's reputation, to prove that one of America's most celebrated singers was actually a fraud. He came with certainty, with conviction, with 12 years of expertise backing his judgments. And in 8 minutes, Frank had completely dismantled everything Caldwell thought he understood about music. Caldwell said he'd been measuring singing by technical standards, range, power, precision, duration, all the quantifiable elements that could be analyzed and compared. He'd spent his entire career judging singers by those metrics, writing reviews that praised or condemned based on those criteria, and he'd been wrong. Not about the metrics themselves, those were real, those mattered, but about what mattered most. Frank had shown him something else. That singing wasn't primarily about the voice, it was about what you did with the voice, how you used it to communicate, how you made choices that prioritized meaning over display, how you let yourself be vulnerable enough to express truth rather than hide behind technical perfection. Caldwell said he'd never heard anyone sing the way Frank just sang, with that level of intentionality, that level of honesty, that level of courage to strip away everything that wasn't essential and just be human with an audience. Frank listened, didn't interrupt. When Caldwell finished, Frank said something simple. He said that criticism was important, that having people who held artists accountable, who maintained standards, who refused to let mediocrity pass as excellence mattered deeply. Caldwell's job was necessary, his expertise valuable, but expertise without understanding was just technique without purpose. Frank said he'd spent 30 years learning how to sing, not learning how to hit higher notes or sustain phrases longer, learning how to communicate truth, learning how to use his voice as a tool of connection, learning how to be honest enough to let people see him, really see him, through the music. And that's what Caldwell had responded to tonight. Not Frank's technical ability, the truth Frank was willing to share, the humanity Frank was willing to reveal. Caldwell asked if Frank knew he was going to interrupt before the show. Frank said no, didn't know Caldwell would be there, didn't know about the planned confrontation, but when it happened, Frank made a choice. He could have responded with anger, with defensiveness, with one of his famous upbeat numbers designed to win the crowd and dismiss the critic, but that wouldn't have addressed what Caldwell was really questioning. So Frank sang truth instead, sang vulnerability, sang humanity, and let that be his response. Caldwell stood, extended his hand. Frank shook it. They didn't say anything else, didn't need to. Something had changed between them. Not friendship, not agreement on everything, but mutual respect, understanding, recognition that they both cared about the same thing. Genuine artistry, even if they'd been measuring it differently. 3 weeks later, Richard Caldwell published an article in the New York Herald, not the exposé he'd planned, something else entirely. An essay about the nature of artistry, about the difference between technical perfection and emotional truth, about how sometimes the most powerful performances come not from singers with the most impressive abilities, but from artists brave enough to be vulnerable. He wrote about Frank Sinatra, but not as a manufactured product, as a master craftsman. Someone who understood that the goal of singing wasn't to demonstrate your voice, but to use your voice to demonstrate something deeper, humanity, truth, connection. The article changed how people talked about Frank. Not everyone, some critics still focused on technical metrics, still measured success by quantifiable standards, but others started listening differently, started asking different questions, started valuing honesty as much as ability. Frank never mentioned the article, never talked about that night publicly. When asked about critics, he would say only that their job was important, that they pushed artists to be better, that even harsh criticism served a purpose if it came from genuine care about the art form. But people who knew Frank, who worked with him, who stood backstage during performances, noticed something. After that night at the Sands, Frank approached every performance slightly differently. Not drastically, not in ways audiences would necessarily notice, but with an even deeper commitment to truth, to vulnerability, to using his voice as a tool of honest communication rather than impressive display. Years later, a young singer asked Frank for advice, asked how to develop your own style, how to stand out in a crowded field, how to make people remember you. Frank thought for a moment, then said this: don't try to be the best singer, try to be the most honest one. Don't focus on what your voice can do. Focus on what your voice can say. Technical ability matters, range matters, control matters, but none of it matters as much as your willingness to tell the truth through music, to let people see who you really are, to risk being vulnerable in front of strangers. The young singer asked if that was scary. Frank said yes, every single time. 30 years into his career, it was still scary to stand on stage and let people see him that completely, but that fear was important. It meant he was doing it right, meant he was risking something real, meant the performance mattered. That night at the Sands Hotel became legendary, not because of the confrontation, because of what the confrontation revealed. That the best response to criticism isn't defense, it's demonstration. That the way to prove your worth isn't through argument, it's through action. That when someone questions your artistry, you don't tell them they're wrong, you show them what artistry really means. Richard Caldwell continued writing criticism for another 20 years. His reviews remained sharp, analytical, uncompromising, but they changed.
Became deeper.
More nuanced, more interested in what artists were trying to communicate than just how well they executed technique.
He wrote about dozens of performers,
Always maintaining high standards, always pushing artists to be better, but he never forgot that night, never forgot how Frank Sinatra taught him the difference between singing well and singing truly. When Caldwell retired, he wrote a final column, reflected on his career, the performances he'd witnessed, the artists he'd championed or challenged, and he wrote about that night at the Sands, wrote that he came to destroy Frank Sinatra and left transformed instead. Wrote that he learned more about music in 8 minutes than in 12 years of professional criticism. Wrote that the measure of great artistry isn't technical perfection, it's the courage to be completely, vulnerably human. Frank read that column, kept it. Years later, when someone asked him what accomplishment he was most proud of, Frank didn't mention the awards, didn't mention the sold-out shows, didn't mention the chart-topping records. He mentioned that night, mentioned changing a critic's mind, not through argument but through truth, mentioned showing someone that real artistry was about connection, not display. That's what 8 minutes created. Not just one performance, not just one converted critic, but a lasting demonstration of what matters most in any art form. The willingness to be honest, the courage to be vulnerable, the understanding that the point isn't to impress people with your abilities, it's to move people with your truth. Who are you trying to impress with your abilities? What would happen if you focused on truth instead? Because 8 minutes of vulnerability can accomplish more than a lifetime of perfect technique. Frank Sinatra proved that on a Tuesday night in Las Vegas, proved it to a critic determined to destroy him, proved it to 1,200 witnesses, and proved it to everyone who's listened to that story since. The performance ended, but the lesson continues. Perfection is forgettable. Truth is unforgettable. Truth is unforgettable.